Jamie Jenkins is here from Wales. Jamie, very good morning to you, sir.
Morning, Mike. I think Hannah the plumber is going to stop your plonk of the week show. I think, Mike, you can't be drinking in work, so make sure
apparently.
you hide all that lemonade. Tell her you're drinking lemonade, Mike, not wine.
It's all right if I shoot up a couple of grams of heroin, though, presumably, and fire up the crack pipe. Maybe do that crack pipe of the week. We could do, but yeah, absolutely insane, isn't it? She made her first attempt at Prime Minister's questions, and that was the best thing she could come up with. Was to say, we shouldn't be drinking in the House of Commons. It's fine, don't drink then, but you don't have to stop everybody else. I mean, it's a typical socialist, isn't it? So if I don't want to do it, you shouldn't be allowed to do it either.
Mike, if I was one of the politicians having to listen to Starmer, I'd need to be half cut to go into Prime Minister's questions. Some of the nonsense he comes up, I'll probably be popping to the studio with you, having 2 bottles of wine, a few pints, then go to Prime Minister's questions. I think that's the only way you can do it.
I think that's absolutely right. Now, you've got a few things to talk to us about, Andy Burnham being one of them, but also the economy as well, because youth unemployment is hitting, an 11-year high. We saw that 210,000 fewer people, I think, working now in the payroll economy than there were same time last year. So it's all going from bad to worse for Rachel Reeves, isn't it?
Yeah, it was a great clip of Reeves getting heckled there, Mike, and I think just cut her off just before she said the economic plan is working. She keeps, it's like a robot, Mike. She keeps saying, our economic plan is working and all this nonsense. And so you're right, yeah, we've lost 210,000 payroll jobs. So that's where you look at HMRC's kind of pay-as-you-earn tax system. It's the most robust data that we have on the economy in terms of jobs, Mike, and 210,000 gone in a year. 100,000 gone in 1 month. Now that might get revised slightly when we get more up-to-date data, but it's clearly the economic plan is only working, Mike, if the plan is to destroy jobs and get more people onto benefits. Because if obviously people aren't working, then they're paying less tax, and then everybody else who's working and having to pay more tax for all the benefits that are going on. And this is the economy that she's kind of overseeing, and younger people are being hammered, Mike. So that 11-year high, that's youth unemployment. So I think you were talking earlier on the show, I think Andy Burnham and free bus travel for youngsters and all that. So I think what we're seeing in Manchester, Mike, is all these youngsters who can't get a job just going round and round on buses all day to keep themselves entertained.
Well, it's a bit like when they started taking away the pensioners' winter fuel allowance, and people were told, if you really want to stay warm, get yourself onto a bus and just sit on it and go round and round and round until you go home. And that way you might not be quite so cold as if you sat without any heating on. But this is the problem. They sort of nibble around at the edges. The idea that she came out with earlier this week, which was to say to supermarkets, we should control the price of eggs and milk and bread. Even the Bank of England, who are usually staunch supporters of this useless government, came out and said it's not sustainable. Retailers said it's preposterous and embarrassing nonsense. You'd think, if you're the Chancellor of the Exchequer, you might maybe canvass a few opinions before you announce things.
Oh, well, that's what this government's all about, mate. And it's a massive distraction. If you think, obviously necessity goods like milk, bread and that kind of stuff, it's a very small percentage of what households will actually pay. If you really want to get money into people's pockets, Mike, the big thing is the lunacy of Ed Miliband and his, net zero crusade, because energy prices, when you look at the energy prices in the UK compared to other countries, if we were, if we weren't importing all of this gas, Mike, from other parts of the world, if we were using our own, or if we had a proper plan, remember that clip from Nick Clegg saying, we don't want to build any nuclear, it won't come online till about 2024. If governments over the last 20, 30 years had a proper plan in place for energy, Mike, that's one of the critical things you ask a government to do, isn't it? To make sure you can warm your house up, have electricity. If our electricity prices were similar to what other countries are, you could buy as much milk, bread, eggs as you wanted. So those things aren't going to turn the needle. And I think that the positive news they're kind of talking about at the moment is inflation coming down yesterday, Mike. So just on that, fuel prices have rocketed, obviously at the pump, they're up around 23%. And then some people were tagging me online about the inflation coming down. Let me just explain. So inflation prices aren't coming down, Mike. It's just in the latest month, they haven't gone up as much as what they had in the previous month. So you need negative inflation for prices to be coming down. So prices still are going up. And the only reason the inflation's come down a little bit is that if you look at energy costs in April 2026, they went up slightly less than what they went up in April 2025. So when you do the annual, like the whole economy inflation rates come down. For people on the, for the man on the street and the woman on the street, prices aren't really coming down for them. They're really being affected by all of this. And to talk about putting limits on supermarkets when the biggest costs to these energy costs that these households are having to pay, it's just gaslighting the public.
Well, exactly right. I mean, I came past the petrol station where I've bought petrol in the past, but I don't. I tend now to try and buy my petrol when I'm outside of London because it's a bit cheaper. But it's now 1.62 for a litre in this particular place in South London. The last time I bought it, I think it was up to sort of 1.59. So it's still kind of creeping up effectively. It's not levelling out. It's not kind of going nowhere. It's still creeping up. And I think most people would say to you, every time they go to the supermarket, they have to be quite careful about how they buy the weekly shop, because if they're not careful, it's suddenly an extra 15, 20 quid, or suddenly maybe an extra 30 quid, And there's no way that inflation, in anybody's reckoning, is going down. And yet that's what the official figures say.
Yeah, well, I took my dad the other day. He said, I fancy some fish and chips. I think, and it's quite cheap in Wales. I think it was a tenner, but some places...
That's very cheap.
It's far more expensive in other parts of the country. And on the fuel, that big announcement where Rachel Reeves was getting heckled, all she was announcing is she was not going to put tax up. She wasn't talking about, we're going to put tax down on fuel and we're going to help the motorists. She just said, yes, we're not going to put the taxes up and we're going to freeze this 5p fuel duty that potentially would have come in the future. We're just going to freeze that. And so the government's clearly out of control, Mike. And you mentioned earlier on about Andy bloody Burnham. And the thing I wrote about on my Substack this week, Mike. So if people want to just Google Stats Jamie, if people are watching, they can follow me and help me on that one. If you look at Andy Burnham, Mike, the question I posed is, if Andy Burnham is the answer, then what is the bloody question? Because he's not going to solve this bloody country in terms of where we are, Mike. I think you talked about this poll, didn't you, that the Labour Party could beat reform if Andy Burnham was in charge. Yeah. I think when Andy Burnham, if he was Prime Minister, and then we start seeing even more socialism in this country, I think people will start waking up smelling the coffee that maybe we want Keir Starmer back.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this is the trouble, as I was saying earlier to Claire Pearsall, the Keir Starmer sort of strategy is to basically bore everybody to death. So you get to the point where you go, well, all right then, you just carry on because everybody else is a bit of a bozo. Wes Streety's now dropped out of a race that he was never in. He's announced this morning that he doesn't want to take part. And you just think, who's running the country, right? I mean, they did an announcement yesterday about trade deals that they've done. You managed to get that wrong, Starmer, and said we've done a trade deal with North Korea, But, meanwhile, supposedly the business of government is going on in the background, but it can't be. It's a bit like, you're driving a car, but you're not really paying attention. And before you know it, you're going to smash into a lamppost.
Well, the government's in paralysis mode, Mike. It wouldn't surprise me, though, if they are doing a deal with North Korea. Maybe Kim Jong-un is going to take over as our Prime Minister with this swap deal.
Kim Jong-Starmer.
Yeah, the football transfer market's opening soon, Mike, with the end of the season. Perhaps we can just swap our Prime Minister for Kim Jong-un and we'll get on with that.
And also, I meant to mention, actually, when you were talking about fish and chips there, because, down the South Coast, for example, if you take, I took my daughter was here at Christmas time and took her out for sort of fish and chips. And it was about sort of 75 quid for four, with a cup of tea. It wasn't even any booze involved, And it's ridiculous. And there was a story the other week that said that an awful lot of the fish and chips shops now in Britain are actually not selling cod and haddock. They're buying in sort of bulk this cheap fish from Southeast Asia, which isn't cod or haddock, but they're selling it as cod or haddock for about sort of 15 to 20 quid a go.
Yeah, I saw that story, Mike, and you're right, and that's kind of partly where the jobs figures that we started the segment off with, why they're coming down, is this hospitality and retail. Generally, people, if you're thinking, it's going to cost me 75 quid, I went out a few weeks back and literally the bill came and the food weren't great, and I think it's in one of these big chains that I was at just because it was convenient to go there, and food weren't great. The bill was over 100 quid just for that, for four people, and it wasn't great food. And I was joking. I was saying, because I had a letter through the post offering some deal to go there. I said, it wouldn't surprise me if they shut down. And then I think, look, I Googled it all, Mike, and a lot of these brewers' fairs, I think, they're next to the Premier Inns. They're closing most of their hospitality, all their food places, to put more hotels in. I'm thinking, are they putting more hotels in because they can do a deal with the government with these small boats? That must be the only place where they're going to be making their money, because people aren't going out as much as they were before to eat. because of the bloody cost of living.
No, well, that's why all these chains are folding, isn't it? You know, we've got Toby Carvery going under. We had the Spaghetti House, which is probably a bit London-centric, but that was, you know, several different venues. The Real Greek, which I know had places in Manchester and I think Brighton as well as London. You know, and a lot of these kind of what you might call mid to small chains, you know, which are not as big as, say, I don't know, Wetherspoons or anything like that. But they're the ones that are suffering because, you know, their margins are not great. And suddenly, if you've got, say, 50% down on the footfall, the number of people coming in to have lunch and dinner, you're out of business.
Yeah, and the vacancies figures, Mike, they're at the 4-year or 5-year low, the number of vacancies in the economy. And where we're seeing those falling as well is those small employers, because when you've got national insurance rate that we've talked about in the last year going up, the minimum wage going up again in this April, young people are being absolutely decimated. The thing for me with what's going on with Rachel Reeves is, if you know, I've heard stories now. I read them online. I hear them on the news on BBC. And probably you get loads of people on your show. You've got people going off to university, doing PhD, racking up thousands and thousands and thousands of pounds worth of debt, and they can't even get a job in McDonald's. No. So I think what the government, this is a really important point here. I think what the government needs to do is, if you're a parent of a child who's thinking of going into university in the next 3 to 4 or 5 years, think now what's going to happen, because a lot of those roles may be replaced by AI that they may have gone into.
Yeah.
And so you want to be having a chat with your son and daughter, thinking, do a job where you actually not going to be replaced by AI, not get a 50 grand debt with it, get yourself a trade, get yourself a business, and make some money yourself. Because you can't trust this government.
And it's not a good, and it's, as you say, it's not a good time to be going somewhere which is going to result in you owing 50 or 60 grand to the state, you know, as a result of an education that you can't really do anything with. Final question for you. The big story this week, to some extent, was also about the European Union. You know, Andy Burnham coming out and basically saying, and having to U-turn on it almost as soon as he said it, you know, that he wants to rejoin the European Union. Wes Streeting saying the same thing, you know, almost putting it all back on the sort of front burner, if you like. But the truth about the economies of the European Union countries is that they're worse off than we are, aren't they?
Yeah, so we always hear from on the Labour Party, and Starmer did his speech last week. He obviously got Burnham and Streeting talking about closer ties with Europe. And Starmer basically came out last week blaming, he was calling out Nigel Farage again. I think Nigel Farage lives rent-free in his head, I think, half the time, because he was saying that Farage said it'd make us richer, but Brexit has made us poorer. And ultimately, I did some data the other day. If you compare the UK since the Brexit vote and compare it to, say, Germany, which is always seen as the bastion of the European Union, our GDP figures are double what we've seen in Germany. And we're on a par with France. We're higher than Italy. So this whole ruse that we think, oh, we're poorer because we weren't in the European Union. Well, what's the excuse for Germany then, Mike? That's the thing. So people, they'll talk the talk. They won't do the walk, Mike. And I think, you know, the appetite to go back into Europe isn't there. We're still in Europe. You know, the UK is in Europe. We're just not in the European Union.
And also the trade that we did with the European Union hasn't really suffered as a result of us leaving. You know, we still do the same amount of business as we did before. You know, what's the problem?
Yeah, people will argue, Mike, that obviously it's less friction. There's more frictions in terms of doing the trade. But that's because the European Union wanted to punish us, Mike. You know, the European Union relies on us buying their products. You know, if you lived in the European Union and that European Union itself was trying to put restrictions on us doing trade with them, it's not good for businesses in Europe as well. So the things with the European Union, Mike, it's bureaucracy. Even the Germans are coming out now, calling out. It wouldn't surprise me if more and more countries in the future look to leave, and the threat to leave, because, you know, all these bureaucrats in Brussels that we don't really get much of a say in voting. Why would you want to go back there? So I think Burnham might say, because Makerfield is a vote leave area, he's obviously going to come out and play down Europe talk, but he's definitely one who'd love to be back in the European Union. And I'm sure Starmer would love to have a job working over there as well.
Oh, I'm sure that's where he'll end up, because we don't want him here, that's for sure. Absolutely great to talk to you. Jamie, thank you very much indeed. Jamie Jenkins, check out his Substack, of course, where he keeps you up to date with all of the figures that are coming out from the government and all the stuff that you need to know about how the economy is actually going and what the indicators truly are. And he cuts through all the nonsense and the red tape and the bluster and the cobblers that comes out of Downing Street and the Treasury and tells you it is as it is, which is great stuff.